Camp Gordon, Georgia, July 1943. The temperature had climbed past 95 degrees by 10 in the morning, and the red clay dust hung in the air like a copper fog. Staff Sergeant James Washington stood at his post outside Compound C, his uniform already dark with sweat, watching the newest arrivals shuffle through the gates in their faded grey uniforms. They were members of the Africa Corps, captured in Tunisia just 3 months earlier during the collapse of the North African campaign, and they carried themselves with the rigid bearing of men who still believed their side would win the conflict. Washington had seen that look before. It usually lasted about 2 weeks before reality began to sink in. What none of these prisoners could have imagined, and what would transform both their understanding and Washington's own, was that the most profound moment of their captivity would come not from deprivation or punishment, but from an impossible conversation in the pre-dawn darkness between one of their officers and a black American guard, a conversation so devastating that both men would carry it in absolute silence for the rest of their lives, yet forever changed by words that shattered carefully constructed walls of propaganda and hate. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how a single whispered exchange between a captured soldier and his black American guard created a silence so heavy, so laden with truth and recognition and shame and possibility, that both men would carry it to their graves, never speaking of what passed between them in those quiet moments before dawn, yet forever changed by words that challenged everything both sides believed about humanity, loyalty, dignity, and the true nature of the ideology they had been fighting for, whether in uniform or simply by their daily existence in a segregated society. James Washington had been assigned to the prisoner of war camp at Fort Gordon 3 months earlier, in April of 1943, as part of the 253rd Military Police Battalion, a unit composed entirely of black soldiers under the command of white officers, which was the standard arrangement in the still segregated United States Army. He was 26 years old, born in Macon, Georgia, the son of Samuel Washington, a sharecropper who had worked the same land for 30 years without ever managing to own a single acre of it, and Esther Washington, a seamstress who had taught herself to read using her children's school books, and who had instilled in all 5 of her children a fierce pride and a determination to rise above the circumstances of their birth. James had been the first in his family to attend college, earning admission to Morehouse College in Atlanta in 1936, with a partial scholarship that covered tuition but nothing else, which meant he had worked 3 jobs simultaneously, cleaning dormitories, washing dishes in the cafeteria, and tutoring other students in mathematics and literature, sleeping perhaps 4 hours a night, and studying whenever he could find a spare moment. He had completed 1 year, learning from professors who were themselves products of a system designed to limit their opportunities, yet who refused to let those limitations define them or their students, before the money ran out entirely, and he had been forced to return home to help support his family. He had joined the Army in 1941, exactly 2 weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, knowing full well that he would face a war on 2 fronts, one against the declared enemies overseas, and one against the prejudice and discrimination that followed him even in uniform, even as he swore an oath to defend a country that in many ways still refused to fully acknowledge his humanity or his rights as a citizen. The irony was not lost on him, and he thought about it often during his duty shifts. Here he stood, in the uniform of the United States Army, guarding enemy prisoners who were treated better in many tangible ways than many black citizens were treated in the very state where the camp was located. The soldiers from overseas received 3 full meals a day, prepared according to the standards set by the Geneva Convention, medical care that was equal to or better than what many Americans had access to, recreational activities including sports leagues and educational classes, access to a library, the right to receive packages from home and to send and receive letters, and generally fair treatment that was monitored by representatives from neutral countries to ensure compliance with international law. Meanwhile, Washington himself could not eat at most restaurants in nearby Augusta, could not use certain public facilities, could not drink from certain water fountains, had to sit in the back of buses even while wearing his uniform, and had to endure the casual contempt of some of his fellow guards white soldiers who made it abundantly clear through word and gesture that they considered him inferior to the men he was guarding, that they believed the prisoners deserved more respect and consideration than he did simply by virtue of being white. But Washington was a professional, and he had been raised by a father who taught him that dignity came from within, from how you conducted yourself and how you treated others, not from the recognition or respect of people who had not earned the right to judge you. He performed his duties with quiet excellence, showing up exactly on time for every shift, maintaining his uniform and equipment to impeccable standards, learning the German language through a correspondence course he completed entirely on his own time, studying late into the night after his shifts ended, memorizing vocabulary and grammar rules with the same discipline he had applied to his college coursework. He read everything he could find about the Geneva Convention and the proper treatment of prisoners of war, memorizing the protocols and regulations, understanding not just the letter of the law but the spirit behind it, the attempt to maintain some measure of humanity even in the midst of industrial-scale violence. He maintained order in his section with a combination of firmness and fairness that even the most hardened and hostile prisoners came to respect, never raising his voice unless absolutely necessary, never using force except as a last resort, but also never hesitating to enforce the rules when enforcement was required, treating the prisoners as human beings who had been captured in combat rather than as enemies to be humiliated or degraded. The prisoner who would change everything arrived on a Tuesday morning in mid-July, stepping off a transport truck along with 47 other men who had been transferred from a processing center in New York. His name was Hauptmann Friedrich Becker, a captain in the armed forces, 34 years old, from a small Bavarian town outside Munich, a place of cobblestone streets and Baroque churches and beer gardens that seemed impossibly distant from this red clay landscape of Georgia pine forests and oppressive heat. He had been captured near Tunis in May, along with 11,000 other soldiers, when the North African campaign collapsed in a matter of days, when supply lines that had been stretched to the breaking point finally snapped, when the combined forces of multiple nations closed in from multiple directions and left no possibility of escape or reinforcement. Becker was tall, perhaps 6 feet 2 inches, with sharp, aristocratic features that suggested generations of good breeding, grey eyes that seemed to catalogue and analyse everything they saw with an almost scientific detachment, and the bearing of someone who had been born into a social class that expected to lead and to be obeyed. He carried himself with dignity despite the heat and the exhaustion of the journey and the humiliation of captivity, and the other prisoners deferred to him immediately, instinctively recognizing authority even in the absence of any official command structure. Washington noticed Becker during the first roll call, conducted at 6 in the evening, after the new prisoners had been fed, processed, assigned to barracks, and given time to rest. While the other prisoners responded to their names with sullen monotone, their voices carrying notes of resentment and defeat and barely suppressed anger, Becker answered with crisp military precision, his posture perfect, despite having spent nearly 14 hours in transit. His response carrying the same tone he might have used during a formal inspection in better days. His uniform, though worn and faded and marked by the rigors of desert warfare and imprisonment, was somehow neater than those of the other prisoners, as if he had spent time during the journey working to maintain its appearance. His boots, though scuffed and showing the wear of thousands of miles of marching, were still polished to a dull shine that caught the evening light. This was a man who refused to let circumstance or defeat diminish his sense of self, who maintained his identity and his standards even when everything else had been stripped away. Over the following days and weeks, Washington observed Becker carefully, making mental notes about the man's behavior and interactions with others, trying to understand who this person was beyond the uniform and the rank. The officer organized the other prisoners in his barracks, not through overt command, but through the subtle influence of someone accustomed to leadership, establishing a daily routine that included physical exercise, cleaning duties, educational discussions, and personal time structured in a way that maintained morale and purpose even in captivity. He settled disputes between prisoners calmly and fairly, listening to all sides before making decisions that others accepted without question. He volunteered for the more difficult work details, setting an example through action rather than just words. He spoke little, at least at first, but when he did speak, men listened with attention and respect. He maintained distance from the guards, neither hostile nor overly friendly, simply correct and professional in all his interactions. Washington learned more about Becker from the intake documents and from conversations with other guards, and from the intelligence reports that were compiled on all officer prisoners. He had been a schoolteacher before the conflict, working at a gymnasium, what Americans would call a high school, in his hometown, teaching history and philosophy to students aged 14 to 18. He spoke 4 languages fluently. His native tongue, English learned during 2 years of study at Cambridge University before the conflict, French from his mother who had been Parisian, and Latin from his classical education. He had published several articles in academic journals about educational methodology and the teaching of critical thinking skills. He had joined the military in 1939, just before the invasion of Poland, not out of ideological fervor, the documents noted, but out of a sense of duty that seemed to be common among men of his background and education. He had served in Poland, in France during the campaign of 1940, and then in North Africa starting in 1941, leading a company of infantry through multiple engagements. He had been wounded twice, once by shrapnel near Tobruk, and once by a bullet that had grazed his shoulder near El Alamein, but had returned to duty both times after minimal recovery periods. He had been recommended for decoration 3 times for tactical skill and leadership under difficult conditions. He had never been a member of the political party, the documents noted carefully, just a soldier doing his duty, or so he had claimed during his initial interrogation. But there was something else Washington noticed, something that was not in any official document, but that became increasingly clear through careful observation. Becker watched him. Not with the open hostility that some of the other prisoners displayed toward the black guards, that mixture of contempt and anger that came from deeply held beliefs about racial hierarchy, and that made some prisoners refuse direct orders or speak insultingly or behave in ways designed to provoke confrontation. And not with the condescending curiosity that others showed, that anthropological interest in examining something they considered exotic or unusual or somehow not quite real, as if black soldiers were subjects for study rather than human beings doing a job. Becker watched Washington the way a scholar might study a text that contradicted everything he had been taught, the way a scientist might observe data that challenged a long-held theory, with a mixture of confusion, fascination, and what looked increasingly like internal conflict. There was something in those gray eyes, particularly when Washington demonstrated competence or knowledge or handled a situation with skill, that suggested deep cognitive dissonance, as if each demonstration of ability challenged some fundamental assumption and created psychological distress that could not be easily dismissed or rationalized away. The first direct interaction came 3 weeks after Becker's arrival, on a Wednesday afternoon, during a routine inspection of the barracks. Washington was conducting his rounds, checking that all equipment was properly maintained, that no contraband had been acquired, that the living spaces met the standards required by regulation, when he found Becker sitting on his bunk in the corner of the long room, reading a battered copy of Plato's Republic in the original ancient Greek. The book was one of the few personal possessions the prisoners had been allowed to keep, one of the items deemed non-threatening and potentially beneficial for morale and mental health during captivity. The pages were yellowed and the binding was cracked, and there were marginal notes in multiple languages filling every available space, evidence of years of study and contemplation. Washington paused in his inspection, his eyes drawn to the familiar text, despite his intention to maintain professional distance. He had read Plato during his single year at Morehouse College, in a philosophy course taught by Dr. Anderson, a brilliant professor who had earned his doctorate from Harvard in 1922, despite facing obstacles that would have defeated lesser men, who had taught his students to question everything and to think deeply about justice and truth and the nature of reality itself. Washington could still remember specific lectures about the allegory of the cave, about the nature of justice and the just society, about the philosopher king, and the idea that leadership should be based on wisdom and virtue rather than birth or strength. He had written a paper analyzing the relationship between Plato's ideal forms and actual political structures, had argued that the pursuit of perfect justice required recognition that all humans possessed reason and therefore deserved equal consideration in the political sphere, and had received the highest marks in the class, along with a note from Dr. Anderson encouraging him to continue his studies. Becker looked up from his reading, and for a long moment their eyes met across the barracks. Washington saw recognition there, saw the German officer registering the pause, noting the direction of Washington's gaze, understanding that this black guard had identified the text and recognized its significance. It was a subtle thing, the kind of moment that might have passed unnoticed by someone less observant, but both men were keenly aware of what had just occurred. An assumption had been challenged, a possibility had been raised. The carefully maintained categories that kept the world ordered and predictable had suddenly become less certain. "You know this work," Becker said, in careful, formal English with a slight British accent from his Cambridge education. It was not quite a question, more an observation that invited confirmation or denial. Washington hesitated, his training and experience warning him about the dangers of fraternization with prisoners beyond what was strictly necessary for the performance of his duties. The Army had clear guidelines about maintaining professional distance, about avoiding personal relationships that might compromise security or create the appearance of preferential treatment. But something in Becker's tone, something that was not challenging or condescending but genuinely curious, something that sounded almost desperate in its need to understand, made him decide to answer. "I studied it briefly," Washington said, his voice neutral and professional. "Before the conflict, in a philosophy course. You were at university." The surprise in Becker's voice was genuine and undisguised, and Washington saw the officer struggle to process this information, to fit it into whatever framework he had been taught about the capabilities and achievements of different races. "For 1 year, at Morehouse College in Atlanta. Then the money ran out and I had to return home to work." Becker nodded slowly, and Washington could almost see the wheels turning in the man's mind, could see him trying to reconcile this new information with his existing beliefs, attempting to maintain his worldview while acknowledging evidence that contradicted it. Then the German captain did something that surprised Washington. He stood from his bunk, carefully marked his place in the ancient text, and offered a slight, respectful nod. Not the exaggerated, mocking deference that some prisoners used as a form of resistance, and not the grudging, minimal acknowledgement that others gave when forced by regulation, but a genuine gesture of respect, the kind of acknowledgement that one educated man might offer another, in recognition of shared intellectual ground. Washington returned the nod with equal formality and continued his inspection, checking the rest of the barracks systematically before moving on to the next building. But something had shifted in the air between them, something subtle but significant. A connection had been made, an acknowledgement that transcended the roles they were supposed to play, prisoner and guard, enemy and captor, member of the supposedly superior race and member of the supposedly inferior one. Over the following weeks, a strange, unspoken relationship developed between them. Becker would sometimes position himself in locations where Washington was assigned to duty, not obviously or in a way that would draw attention from other guards or prisoners, but close enough that small exchanges could occur naturally as part of the routine of camp life. He would ask questions about American literature, mentioning that he had read works by Mark Twain and F. Scott Fitzgerald, and wondering what Washington thought of them. He would inquire about the camp's procedures, seeking clarification on regulations, not because he intended to violate them, but because he seemed genuinely interested in understanding the system. He would make careful observations about the progress of the conflict based on what little news filtered into the camp, asking Washington's assessment of various military developments without ever asking for classified information or anything that would compromise security. Washington answered when appropriate, always remaining professional, always staying within the boundaries of what was permitted, but gradually engaging in conversations that went beyond the minimal required interaction. He would recommend books from the camp library, knowing that Becker's intellectual curiosity was genuine and that access to reading material was one of the few reliefs from the monotony of captivity. He would explain American idioms that confused the German officer, helping him better understand the casual speech of the other guards and the prisoners from other nations who had picked up English. He would occasionally discuss philosophy or literature, sharing perspectives and engaging in the kind of intellectual discourse that both men clearly missed from their previous lives as teachers and students. But beneath these surface conversations, both men seemed to be conducting a different dialogue entirely. Washington could sense that Becker was wrestling with something profound, something that went far beyond simple questions about books or camp procedures. The German officer was systematically collecting evidence, cataloguing observations, building a case that challenged everything he had been taught. Every conversation they had, every demonstration of Washington's intelligence or capability or dignity, seemed to add another piece to a puzzle that Becker was trying desperately to solve, or perhaps to a structure he was trying desperately to maintain against mounting evidence of its fundamental flaws. Washington noticed other changes in Becker's behavior during this period. The German officer began to pay more attention to all the black guards, not just Washington, watching how they performed their duties, how they interacted with prisoners and with each other, how they maintained discipline and order. He started to challenge, very subtly and carefully, some of the racist assumptions expressed by other prisoners, not through direct confrontation which might have created hostility and resistance, but through Socratic questions that made men examine their own beliefs. He organized discussion groups among the prisoners, ostensibly to practice English and to pass time, but the topics he chose, the questions he raised, the directions he guided conversations, all seemed designed to make men think critically about the ideas they had accepted without question. Washington observed all of this with a mixture of hope and caution. He had seen prisoners change their attitudes before, had watched men move from hostility to grudging respect, to genuine friendship as they spent time in the camp, and realized that their guards were not the monsters they had been led to expect. But Becker's transformation seemed different, more fundamental, more deeply rooted in intellectual and moral crisis rather than simple exposure to different experiences. This was not just a man adjusting to new circumstances. This was someone whose entire worldview was crumbling, whose foundational beliefs were proving to be built on sand, and who was struggling to understand what that meant for everything he had done and believed and taught to others. The crisis came to a head on an August morning, just before dawn, during one of those magical hours when the Georgia heat finally relented, and the air felt almost cool against the skin, and the pine forests released their scent into the darkness, and the world seemed to pause between night and day. Washington had drawn the night shift, walking the perimeter of the compound between 3 in the morning and 7 in the morning. 4 hours of solitary patrol, during which the camp was mostly quiet, except for the occasional sound of men coughing or turning in their sleep, or the distant bark of a dog from one of the nearby farms. It was a shift that some guards disliked because of the isolation and the long hours of darkness, but Washington found it peaceful, a time when he could think without interruption, when he could be alone with his thoughts and observations and the complicated feelings that came from his position as a black man guarding white prisoners who were treated better than many black citizens in his own country. He was making his rounds near the compound fence, checking that all was secure, when he heard movement in the darkness ahead. Someone was standing at the fence about 20 meters away, their hands gripping the wire, staring out at the forest beyond. Washington approached quietly, his hand resting on his nightstick, not because he expected trouble, but because protocol required alertness, even in seemingly harmless situations. As he drew closer, he recognized the silhouette. Becker stood at the fence, his posture suggesting that he carried the weight of the entire world on his shoulders, his head bowed, his whole body radiating an anguish that was almost palpable in the pre-dawn stillness. "Captain Becker," Washington said quietly, not wanting to startle the man. "You should return to your barracks. You know the rules about being outside during night hours." Becker turned slowly, and in the dim light of the perimeter lamps, Washington saw that the man's face was wet with tears. The proud officer who had maintained perfect composure through capture and imprisonment and the daily humiliations of captivity, who had held himself together through the collapse of everything he had fought for, was weeping openly, unable or unwilling to hide his emotional state. "I have been a fool," Becker said in his native tongue, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the quiet air. "Such a terrible, unforgivable fool." Washington understood the words, though he had never let any of the prisoners know the full extent of his language skills. understanding that this knowledge might be useful for security purposes, and that revealing it would eliminate his ability to overhear conversations that prisoners thought were private. "You need to return to your quarters, Captain. The patrols change soon, and if someone else finds you here, there will be consequences." "No, please." Becker gripped the fence tighter, his knuckles white in the lamplight. "I must speak. I must tell someone, or I will lose my sanity. I cannot carry this alone any longer." Washington glanced around quickly, confirming that they were alone. The nearest guard tower was over 200 meters away, too far for the guards there to see clearly in the darkness or to hear conversation conducted at low volume. The next patrol would not pass this section for at least 20 minutes. By all rights and regulations, he should report this incident immediately, should escort the prisoner back to his barracks and file a report about suspicious behavior that might indicate planning for escape or some other security concern. But something in Becker's voice, in the raw desperation of his tone, in the visible anguish that had broken through all his carefully maintained defenses, made Washington pause and reconsider. This was not a security threat. This was a man in psychological crisis, someone who needed to unburden himself or risk complete breakdown. "Speak quietly," Washington said, making his decision and switching to his careful but serviceable version of the other language. "And quickly. We do not have much time." Becker's eyes widened at hearing his native tongue from the lips of this black American guard, and Washington saw something break completely inside the man. All the carefully maintained composure, all the aristocratic bearing, all the dignity he had clung to as the last remaining piece of his former identity, crumbled like a sandcastle touched by a wave. His face contorted with emotions he had clearly been suppressing for weeks or months, and fresh tears streamed down his face unchecked. "They told us you were inferior," Becker began, his voice shaking with the force of his recognition and shame. "They told us this with such absolute certainty, with such elaborate scientific language, with such detailed theories and measurements and classifications. They told us this was established fact, as certain as the laws of physics, as undeniable as mathematics. They brought professors to lecture us, scientists with credentials and titles, men who presented charts and graphs and statistics that supposedly proved beyond any doubt that different races had different capacities, different levels of intelligence, different degrees of humanity. And I believed them, God help me, I believed them without question, because I wanted to believe them, because it made everything simpler and clearer, because it gave us purpose and direction and a sense of our own importance in history, because it justified everything we were doing and everything we were being asked to do." He paused, drawing a shuddering breath that rattled in his chest like something breaking loose. "But you are not inferior. You are educated, more educated than many of my fellow officers, who come from families with money but no culture. You speak multiple languages. You understand philosophy and literature. You perform your duties with more professionalism and discipline than half my own officers ever showed. You maintain your dignity in the face of conditions that would break lesser men, that do break lesser men, that have broken me. You show more intelligence, more capability, more essential human worth than I have any right to expect after what we have done, after what we have believed, after what we have built our entire worldview upon." Washington stood very still, his hand falling away from his nightstick, understanding that he was witnessing something profound and dangerous and unprecedented. Becker was not seeking sympathy or understanding or absolution for specific actions. He was facing the complete collapse of his ideological framework, the dissolution of the fundamental assumptions that had structured his entire understanding of reality and humanity and his own place in the world. This was not a small crisis of faith or a temporary moment of doubt. This was the total annihilation of everything he had believed and built his identity upon, and the weight of that recognition was crushing him. "I was a teacher," Becker continued, the words pouring out now as if a dam had burst and there was no way to stop the flood. "I taught young men about civilization and culture and the great achievements of humanity across history. I taught them about ancient Greece and Rome, about the Renaissance, about the Enlightenment and the progress of human knowledge. But all the while, woven through every lesson, was this poison. This idea that some humans were more human than others. This belief that race determined capability, that biology was destiny, that there was a natural hierarchy with us at the top and others arranged below in descending order of worth. I fed my students these lies along with the truth. I mixed poison with their intellectual nutrition. I helped prepare them to commit acts that I never could have imagined myself capable of justifying 5 years ago, acts that would have horrified me, acts that I told myself were necessary when I heard about them or witnessed them or participated in them. He turned to face Washington directly, his grey eyes now red and swollen but blazing with terrible recognition. In North Africa, I witnessed things I told myself were necessary for victory, for survival, for the accomplishment of our objectives. Things I convinced myself were justified because I believed the fundamental premise that some lives mattered less than others, that some people were more expendable than others, that their suffering counted for less in the moral calculus because they were lesser beings. But the premise was wrong. It was all built on lies. It was a structure built on sand, and now it is collapsing, and I can see what it was hiding, what it was used to justify, what I helped enable by teaching these ideas and defending them and treating them as respectable academic theory, rather than the monstrous falsehood they always were. Washington felt his throat tighten and his chest constrict, understanding what Becker was really confessing. Not just the abstract ideology, not just the theoretical framework, but the concrete actions that had flowed from those beliefs. The things done to people deemed inferior, the things done to Jews and Slavs and Roma and anyone else who fell outside the narrow circle of acceptable humanity, the camps that were whispered about, the actions that were hinted at but never fully described, the systematic program of murder and degradation that was being carried out even now, while they stood here in the pre-dawn darkness, thousands of miles away. "I cannot undo what I have done," Becker said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might make the horror more real. "I cannot unknow what I now know. I cannot go back and unteach the lessons I taught, cannot take back the ideas I helped spread, cannot undo the actions I enabled through my teaching and my beliefs. I watched you these past weeks, day after day, and every single day you have been living proof of the lie I helped propagate. Every demonstration of your intelligence, every example of your capability, every instance of your essential human dignity has been a hammer blow against everything I believed. You are everything they told me you could not be. And if they were wrong about this, if they were fundamentally and completely wrong about something so basic, then what else were they wrong about? What other horrors have I justified based on false premises? What have I done or failed to stop others from doing because I accepted theories that were always nothing more than convenient lies?" He gripped the fence so hard that his knuckles turned bone white and his hands shook with the strain. "I have 3 brothers still fighting somewhere in Europe. I have dozens of former students scattered across multiple fronts. Young men I taught, young minds I helped shape, now carrying rifles and beliefs I helped instill. They still believe what I taught them. They are acting on assumptions I helped make seem respectable and scientific and inevitable. They are doing things, or allowing things to be done, or participating in things that will stain history forever. And there is nothing I can do to stop them. Nothing I can do to send them a message. Nothing I can do to take back the poison I helped spread through my teaching and my example and my willingness to accept convenient lies rather than uncomfortable truths." The silence that followed was absolute and oppressive, heavy with the weight of recognition and shame, and the awful knowledge of complicity in monstrous crimes. Washington could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, could feel the weight of Becker's confession settling over both of them like a physical presence, could sense that this moment would stay with him for the rest of his life, regardless of what he chose to do or say next. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds or so, Washington spoke, choosing his words with extreme care. "What do you want from me, Captain?" Becker looked at him with eyes that held depths of anguish Washington had rarely seen in another human being. "I want you to know that I understand now. I want you to know that at least one of us sees the truth, even if that knowledge came too late to prevent anything, even if it changes nothing about what has already been done. I want you to know that I recognize your full humanity, that I acknowledge the lies I believed and spread, that I accept responsibility for the role I played in helping to create and maintain a system built on monstrous falsehoods. I want to somehow balance the scales, though I know that is impossible, that nothing I can do now will undo the damage already done, and I want to warn you. Warn me about what? About how easily intelligent people, educated people, supposedly moral people, can be made to believe monstrous things, about how seductive it is to accept theories that elevate yourself and your group while diminishing others, that give you a sense of importance and purpose and historical destiny, about how rational men who pride themselves on logic and reason, can rationalize the completely irrational until they are doing things, or accepting things, or enabling things that would have horrified them just a few years earlier, before the systematic indoctrination began. Becca's voice dropped even lower, barely audible. In the camps back home, they are doing things that history will never forgive, things that will stain my nation for generations to come. Things based on the same lies I helped teach, the same theories I helped make respectable, the same assumptions I helped spread among young minds. And the men doing these things are not monsters who were born evil. They are men like me, teachers and doctors and lawyers and fathers and husbands, men who believed they were serving a higher purpose, who convinced themselves that temporary cruelty was justified by ultimate goals, who accepted that some lives could be sacrificed for the greater good, because those lives belonged to people who were not really people, not really fully human, not really deserving of the same moral consideration. Washington felt ice run down his spine despite the warm Georgia night. He had heard rumors, fragmentary reports from Europe that seemed too terrible to believe, accounts so monstrous that part of his mind had rejected them as exaggerations or propaganda designed to motivate the home front. But here was an officer from the other side, someone who had no reason to lie, and every reason to minimize or deny such reports, confirming them with the certainty of someone who had seen evidence firsthand. The whispered stories about camps designed not to hold prisoners, but to kill them, about systematic programs of murder disguised as relocation, about industrial processes applied to the extermination of human beings, all of it was true. All of it was happening. And men like Becca, educated men, moral men, supposedly civilized men, had helped create the ideological framework that made it possible. "Why are you telling me this?" Washington asked, his voice barely functioning through the tightness in his throat. "What do you expect me to do with this information? Because you deserve to know that not all of us are blind. Because you deserve to know that at least some of us, even if too few and too late, have come to recognize the truth. Because I need to confess to someone who has every right to hate me, to reject me, to laugh at my pathetic awakening to reality, to dismiss my recognition as meaningless given how late it has come and how much damage has already been done. Because perhaps if I speak this truth aloud, to you, to someone who embodies everything I was taught to despise and dismiss, I can find some small way to live with what I have been part of, what I have enabled, what I have failed to oppose when opposition might have mattered." Becca reached through the fence, not aggressively but with a desperate, pleading gesture that reminded Washington of medieval paintings of souls reaching out from purgatory, seeking some form of redemption or release. "I am asking you to do something that you have absolutely no obligation to do, something that goes against all reason and justice. I am asking you to accept my acknowledgement of your full humanity, my recognition of the lies I believed and helped spread, my horror at what those lies enabled and what they continue to enable. Not because I deserve your acceptance, because I do not deserve anything from you except contempt and rejection, but because I need to believe that truth can still matter, that recognition of error can still count for something even when it comes far too late to prevent the consequences of that error, that there is still some possibility of redemption through honest witness, even when redemption can never undo the harm already done." Washington looked at the extended hand, at the desperate plea in Becca's eyes, at the complete dissolution of the proud officer who had arrived at the camp 7 weeks earlier. Every fiber of his being, every experience of discrimination and prejudice and casual dismissal he had endured throughout his life, told him to walk away. This man represented everything he had fought against, every theoretical justification for the indignities he had suffered, every supposedly scientific rationale for segregation and subordination, and the denial of basic human rights. This man had taught others to see people like Washington as less than fully human, as beings whose suffering counted for less, whose lives mattered less, whose dignity could be discarded without moral consequence. But Washington also understood something that perhaps only someone who had lived his life could understand: the extraordinary courage it took to admit fundamental error, to face the complete collapse of one's entire worldview, to confess sins that could never be fully atoned for. He understood the difference between someone who remained willfully blind despite evidence and someone who had truly seen and been changed by that seeing. He understood that there were different kinds of hope in the world: the false hope that came from denying reality, and the genuine hope that came from facing truth, no matter how painful that truth might be. He did not take Becker's hand. To do so felt like it would minimize or dismiss the real harm that had been done, would suggest that a single moment of recognition could somehow balance against the systematic evil that had been perpetrated. But he met the officer's eyes with a steady gaze that held both acknowledgement and challenge. "I cannot forgive what you have done, Captain," Washington said carefully. "That is not my place. And those you have truly wronged, those who have suffered and died because of the ideology you helped spread, are not here to speak for themselves. Their forgiveness, if they could give it, cares not mine to offer on their behalf. But I can acknowledge that you have seen truth even if it came late, even if it cannot change what has already been done. And I can tell you that this recognition, this understanding you have reached, must not be the end of anything. If you survive this conflict and return home, you have an obligation to speak this truth, to teach it as forcefully as you once taught the lies, to spend the rest of your life trying to undo the damage you helped create, knowing that you can never fully succeed, but that the attempt itself is the only honorable path forward." Becker nodded slowly, tears still streaming down his face, but with something new in his expression now. Not quite hope, because hope seemed too light a word for the burden he was accepting, but perhaps something like purpose, like direction, like the first glimpse of a path forward through the darkness. "I will. I swear to you on everything I have left to swear upon. I will dedicate whatever remains of my life to opposing the lies I once spread and teaching the truth I have learned. And you must never speak of this conversation," Washington continued, his voice taking on a harder edge, "because if you do, they will dismiss it. They will say you are a broken prisoner trying to curry favor with your captors. They will use your confession to undermine the truth you have discovered, will say that you were coerced or manipulated, or that you were speaking under duress. They will take your genuine recognition and turn it into propaganda, will use it to claim that prisoners of war are being mistreated, or that confessions obtained during captivity are worthless. Better to let them believe you still hold to the old ideas, to maintain your dignity and your standing among your fellow prisoners. And then, when the moment comes, when your voice might actually matter, when you are home and free and able to speak without the taint of captivity hanging over your words, speak then. Speak with all the force and clarity you can summon." "And what of you?" Becker asked, his voice steadying somewhat. "Will you report this conversation? Will you tell your superiors what I have confessed?" Washington considered this question carefully, weighing his duty to follow protocol against his understanding of what would actually serve justice and truth. By all rights, he should report this entire encounter. It had gone far beyond acceptable prisoner-guard interaction. It touched on sensitive intelligence matters regarding conditions in Europe. It represented the kind of fraternization that could compromise security or create difficulties. But he also understood that some moments transcended protocol, that some truths were too important and too fragile to be subjected to the grinding machinery of official reports and bureaucratic procedures. "No," Washington said finally, "I will not speak of this either, because if I report it, you will immediately be seen as weak, as compromised, as someone whose statements cannot be trusted. Your ability to eventually speak truth, to teach and influence others when that might actually matter, will be destroyed. You will be dismissed as a collaborator, or a defeatist, or someone who broke under the pressures of captivity. And because some things are too important to be reduced to official reports and intelligence assessments and the kind of bureaucratic processing that strips meaning from truth in the name of administrative efficiency." Becker straightened slightly, regaining some measure of composure, his military bearing reasserting itself even as his face remained marked by tears. "Then we are both bound by this silence, both carrying this burden. We are. And that silence, that shared knowledge, must be a bond that changes how we live going forward, not just a secret to be kept. Thank you, Sergeant Washington." Becker's voice carried genuine gratitude, mixed with acknowledgement of the weight they were both accepting. "You have shown me more mercy than I deserve, more grace than I have any right to expect." Washington shook his head firmly. "This is not mercy, Captain. This is not grace. This is a burden I am placing on you, perhaps the heaviest burden you will ever carry. You must live with what you know now. You must carry the weight of your recognition of truth and your previous spreading of lies. You must face every day knowing what you helped enable and what you can never undo. And someday when it matters, when your voice can make a difference, you must speak regardless of the personal cost. That is not mercy. That is perhaps the hardest thing anyone can be asked to do, to live in the full knowledge of your own complicity in evil, to accept responsibility without the comfort of denial or rationalization, and to dedicate whatever time you have left to opposing what you once supported." Becker nodded slowly, understanding settling over his features like a physical weight. "I accept this burden. I accept the obligation. I will carry it for as long as I live, however long that may be." They stood in silence for a long moment, two men separated by a fence made of wire and wood, but connected now by something far stronger and more enduring than the physical barrier between them. Connected by a shared understanding of truth that neither could fully articulate, by the recognition of a moral reality that transcended nationality and ideology, and all the carefully constructed categories that humans created to make sense of a complex world. "Return to your barracks, Captain," Washington said finally, his voice formal once more, resuming the professional tone appropriate to his role. "Dawn is coming soon and the patrols will change. You should not be found outside." Becker turned away from the fence, moving slowly as if the weight of their conversation had made him physically heavier. He paused once, perhaps 10 steps away, and looked back. "What you do, Sergeant Washington, the dignity you maintain in the face of everything, every insult and indignity and casual dismissal of your worth, it is more powerful than any weapon. It is proof that speaks louder than any argument. Do not let them take that from you. Do not let anything or anyone diminish what you are." Then he walked back into the darkness toward his barracks, his figure gradually disappearing into the shadows between the buildings, leaving Washington alone with the weight of what had just occurred and the knowledge he would carry in silence for the rest of his life. Washington stood at the fence for a long time after Becker disappeared from view, watching the eastern sky begin to lighten with the first hints of dawn, thinking about the confession he had just heard and the burden both men had just accepted. He thought about the profound irony of this situation, that a German officer had confessed his ideological sins to a black American guard who himself faced discrimination and prejudice in his own country, who was fighting for a nation that in many ways still refused to fully acknowledge his humanity or grant him equal rights and dignity, that the prisoner had found his humanity and recognized the truth while the guard was still fighting for recognition of his own full personhood in the country he had sworn to defend. And he thought about what Becker had said, about how easily intelligent people could be led to believe monstrous things, how seductive it was to accept theories that elevated one's own group while diminishing others. Washington knew this was not just a German problem, not just a particular historical moment that could be quarantined and dismissed as an aberration. The same human capacity for rationalized evil existed everywhere, in every society, in every era. The same ability to create hierarchies of human worth, to justify mistreatment based on fabricated differences, to convince oneself that injustice was actually justice, that cruelty was actually necessary, that discrimination was actually natural order existed everywhere humans existed, including in his own country, including in the American South, where he had been born and raised. The difference was only in degree and implementation, and the specific forms the ideology took, but the fundamental mechanism, the human willingness to believe comfortable lies rather than uncomfortable truths, The desire to feel superior by defining others as inferior, that was universal. And recognizing that universality, understanding that the potential for such evil was part of human nature, rather than something unique to particular groups or nations, made resistance to it all the more important and all the more difficult. As the sky continued to lighten and the darkness gradually gave way to the gray twilight that preceded sunrise, Washington resumed his patrol, walking the perimeter with careful attention to his duties. He would file no report of the conversation. He would maintain his professional demeanor with all the prisoners, including Becker. He would continue to do his job with the same excellence he had always brought to it, and he would carry the secret of that dawn encounter for the rest of his life, never speaking of it to another soul, never mentioning it even to his wife or children or closest friends, keeping it locked away in a place where secrets were kept, not because they were shameful, but because they were too sacred to be casually shared. The days that followed were outwardly unchanged in their surface appearance. Becker returned to his daily routine with the same punctuality and discipline. Washington continued his shifts with the same professionalism. But both men carried something different now, an understanding that colored everything they did and saw. Washington noticed subtle changes in Becker's behavior over the following weeks. The officer became more engaged with the other prisoners, organizing discussion groups and educational sessions that went beyond simple language practice. He would lead conversations about literature and philosophy, carefully choosing topics and questions that encouraged critical thinking without directly confronting the beliefs the men held. Washington would sometimes be assigned as guard during these sessions, and he would watch as Becker gradually planted seeds of doubt, asking questions that made men examine their assumptions, pointing out contradictions that had been invisible before. 3 months after their conversation, Becker requested a meeting with the camp commandant, Colonel William Harrison, a career officer who had served in the previous conflict and who approached his duties with a mixture of strict adherence to protocol and genuine interest in the welfare of both his guards and his prisoners. Becker offered to assist in the re-education program that the United States military was developing for prisoners of war, a program designed to prepare captured soldiers for their eventual return to a post-conflict society that would need rebuilding, not just physically but morally and philosophically. He suggested curriculum topics, proposed teaching methods that emphasized critical thinking rather than simple replacement of one ideology with another, and volunteered to help his fellow prisoners prepare for the complicated process of returning to a defeated nation and beginning the work of reconstruction. Colonel Harrison was initially skeptical of the offer. German officers rarely cooperated to this extent, particularly those who had held positions of responsibility and authority. Most maintained their loyalty to their former cause, if not to the specific regime, and saw cooperation with re-education efforts as a form of betrayal. But something in Becker's demeanor, in the evident sincerity of his offer and the thoughtfulness of his proposals, convinced Harrison to accept the assistance. Becker became an instructor in the camp's education program, teaching German language to American personnel who might be assigned to occupation duty after the conflict ended, leading seminars on European history that emphasized the complex causes of conflicts rather than simple narratives of good and evil, and quietly, carefully, helping other prisoners begin to question the ideology that had brought them to this place. Washington was frequently assigned as the security presence for these classes and seminars. He and Becker maintained their professional distance in public settings, never giving any indication of the connection that existed between them, never exchanging more than the minimal communication required by their respective roles. But there were moments, brief exchanges of glances across a classroom or during a roll call, when both men acknowledged the bond forged in that pre-dawn conversation, when their eyes met and something passed between them that no one else could see or understand. The conflict in Europe continued through the fall and winter of 1943 and into 1944. News filtered into the camp through official channels and through letters from home that prisoners and guards alike received, though the information was often fragmented and censored. The Allied forces were advancing on multiple fronts, pushing back the territorial gains that had seemed so impressive and permanent just a few years earlier. Cities were being reduced to rubble by round-the-clock aerial bombardment. Entire armies were being destroyed on the Eastern Front in battles of unprecedented scale and brutality. And as the forces advanced, they discovered the camps that Becker had alluded to during his confession, the places where the ideology of racial superiority had been implemented with industrial efficiency and systematic thoroughness. When the first photographs and reports reached Camp Gordon in the spring of 1945, when the full scope of the atrocities became undeniable, even to those who had been willing to dismiss earlier accounts as exaggeration or propaganda, Becker withdrew into himself completely. For 3 days he ate nothing, spoke to no one, simply sat on his bunk in the barracks staring at nothing, the weight of his earlier recognition crushing him with renewed force now that the abstract knowledge had become concrete evidence, now that the whispered rumors had become documented fact, now that the moral horror he had intellectually grasped had become visual reality, captured in photographs that could not be denied or dismissed. Washington found him on the third evening of this withdrawal, standing outside the barracks in the fading light, his face hollow and his eyes empty in a way that suggested he had traveled to some internal place where ordinary human connection could not reach. Washington approached quietly, understanding that this was a crisis point, that Becker was teetering on the edge of complete psychological collapse. "Captain," Washington said quietly, "you need to continue. You cannot let this destroy you completely." Becker looked at him with eyes that held depths of suffering that Washington had rarely seen. "How can I continue knowing the full extent of what I helped enable? How can anyone continue after seeing that?" "Because stopping now would be the final betrayal of everything you recognized that night at the fence," Washington said firmly. "You have an obligation to the truth you discovered. You have an obligation to speak it, to teach it, to make sure that what happened is understood for exactly what it was. No euphemisms, no minimization, no comfortable lies that allow people to look away. You cannot undo the past, Captain. None of us can. But you can shape how it is remembered and what lessons are learned from it, and that obligation is more important now than it has ever been. I do not deserve to survive when so many have perished, when so many suffered and died because of beliefs I helped spread." "Perhaps not," Washington acknowledged, not offering false comfort. "But you are surviving anyway. That is the reality you must face. The question is not whether you deserve to survive, because that question has already been answered by the mere fact of your continued existence. The question is what you do with that survival. You can let guilt consume you until you are useless to everyone, including yourself, or you can transform that guilt into action, into dedication, into a life lived in service of truth and opposition to the lies you once spread. You can become a living testament to the possibility of change, of recognition, of moral awakening, however late it may come and however inadequate it may be to balance the harm already done." Becker studied Washington's face in the twilight, searching for something, perhaps judgment or condemnation, or the righteous anger that would be entirely justified. "How can you, of all people, after everything you know about what I believed and taught, offer me this? How can you show this much concern for whether I continue or collapse?" "Because I understand that justice is not simple," Washington said. "It is not just about punishment or retribution or making people suffer for their sins. It is also about transformation, about breaking cycles of hatred and ignorance, about ensuring that the next generation learns different lessons than the last generation. And because I believe that your genuine recognition of truth, your real confrontation with what you believed and what it enabled, might prevent future horrors in a way that simple punishment cannot. If you speak, if you teach, if you dedicate yourself to opposing the ideology you once supported, you might reach people that I never could, people who would dismiss my words as those of someone with self-interest in opposing their beliefs, but who might listen to you because you once shared their assumptions and can speak to why those assumptions are false." Becker slowly nodded, something like resolution beginning to form in his expression. "I will continue. I will speak. I will teach. Though it costs me everything I have left, though it brings me shame and rejection and the hatred of those who still believe, I will make sure that what happened is never forgotten, never minimized, never rationalized into something acceptable. That is all anyone can ask. That is all that can be done now." The conflict in Europe ended in May 1945 with the unconditional surrender of all remaining forces. The camps were liberated, and the evidence of systematic murder became undeniable to all but the most willfully blind. The process of determining what to do with millions of prisoners of war began, complicated by questions of justice and reconstruction, and the need to rebuild a functioning society from the ruins. Becker was repatriated to his homeland in October 1945, part of a transport of several hundred prisoners who had been cleared for return based on their records and their cooperation during captivity. Before he left Camp Gordon, he sought out Washington one final time, finding him during a shift change at the edge of the compound. They stood in the autumn sunlight, surrounded by the bustle of departure preparations, but somehow isolated in their own moment. "I owe you a debt I can never repay," Becker said simply. "You owe me nothing," Washington replied, "but you owe the truth everything. You owe it to those who suffered and died. You owe it to those who will come after. That is the debt you must spend the rest of your life trying to repay. I will spend every day I have left trying to honor that obligation." Becker extended his hand one final time. This time, Washington took it without hesitation. They shook once, firmly, and then Becker turned and joined the line of prisoners boarding the transport trucks that would take them to the ships that would carry them home to a country they would barely recognize, a nation that would need to confront its own past and find a way forward. Washington never saw him again in person, but years later, in 1963, a package arrived at Washington's home in Atlanta, where he had settled after leaving the military and become a teacher himself, working at a high school in a changing neighborhood where he taught history and literature to students who were themselves navigating the complicated terrain of a society in transition. Inside the package was a book, published in the original language with an English translation included, bound in simple gray cloth with the title embossed in black, "The Pedagogy of Prejudice: How Intelligent People Are Taught to Believe Lies." The author was Friedrich Becker. Washington read the book in one sitting, unable to put it down, recognizing in its pages the continuation of the conversation that had begun 20 years earlier at a Georgia fence in the pre-dawn darkness. It was a detailed examination of how ordinary people had been systematically indoctrinated into accepting racial ideology, how educational systems had been corrupted to serve propaganda purposes, how intelligent and moral people had been led step by step into believing and acting upon monstrous falsehoods. But it was also a confession, a brutally honest acknowledgement of Becker's own role in teaching these ideas, a passionate argument for how education could be used to prevent such indoctrination in the future, and a warning about the universal human susceptibility to comfortable lies that elevated oneself while diminishing others. In the acknowledgement section, written in both languages, there was a single sentence that made Washington pause and read again. "To the American sergeant who showed me what truth looks like when it confronts comfortable lies, and who gave me a burden I have tried to carry with honor. This work is my attempt to fulfill the obligation he placed upon me." Washington closed the book carefully and sat for a long time in his study, thinking about that dawn conversation 20 years earlier, thinking about the strange geometry of grace and justice that had unfolded in a Georgia prisoner of war camp, thinking about the long arc of a moral reckoning that had begun with tears at a fence and continued through decades of difficult work. He never responded to the book or attempted to contact Becker. The silence they had agreed upon remained intact, but he kept the book on his shelf, and sometimes late at night when he was preparing lessons for his students about the importance of critical thinking and the dangers of accepting comfortable lies, he would take it down and read passages, finding in Becker's words a kind of vindication of the choice he had made that morning, to give burden rather than dismissal, to demand transformation rather than simply condemn. Becker continued his work throughout the decades that followed. He became a prominent educator, a vocal advocate for democratic values and critical thinking, and a tireless opponent of any resurgence of extremist ideology in any form. He taught generations of students about the dangers of prejudice, about the responsibility each person had to examine their own beliefs, about the ease with which intelligent people could be led astray by appealing lies that offered simple answers to complex questions. He spoke at universities and schools, wrote articles and gave interviews, and never shrank from acknowledging his own past complicity in spreading the ideology he now opposed. He maintained throughout that his awakening had come during his time as a prisoner of war, but he never mentioned the specific conversation or the specific person who had catalyzed that awakening. The silence held. Washington died in 1987 at the age of 70, having lived to see enormous changes in his country, though not all the changes he had hoped for. His obituary in the Atlanta newspaper noted his military service during the conflict, his long career as an educator, his contributions to his community and his dedication to his family. It did not mention a conversation with a German prisoner of war at a Georgia fence in the pre-dawn hours of an August morning in 1943. Becker died in 1991 at the age of 82, having devoted nearly half a century to the work of education and moral reconstruction. His obituary in the Munich newspaper noted his scholarship, his teaching, his work in post-conflict reconciliation, and his unwavering commitment to ensuring that the horrors of the past were never forgotten or minimized. It did not mention an American guard who had offered him not forgiveness, but something more valuable, the burden of truth and the obligation to speak it. But in Becker's papers, donated to the University of Munich after his death, and opened to researchers 5 years later, archivists found a journal entry dated August 1943, written in English, in a careful, precise hand that had clearly been practiced many times to achieve fluency. Today I met a man who showed me the truth of my own blindness and the depth of my own complicity in evil. He was everything I had been taught he could not be. Educated, dignified, capable, fully and completely human in ways that shattered every assumption I had accepted without question. And in showing me this, in refusing to absolve me or offer comfortable forgiveness, in giving me instead the burden of truth and the obligation to speak it regardless of cost, he offered me something more valuable than forgiveness could ever be. He offered me the possibility of redemption through honest witness, through dedicated opposition to the lies I once spread, through a life lived in service of truth, however painful that truth might be. I do not know if I can carry this burden adequately. I do not know if anything I do can ever balance against the harm I have enabled. But I know I must try, for the rest of whatever days I have, to speak the truth I have learned, and to oppose with every resource I possess the lies I once taught. This is not penance, because penance suggests the possibility of absolution. And I understand now that what I have been part of admits no such easy resolution. This is obligation. This is the only way forward from here. This is what I owe to truth, to those who suffered, to those who will come after, and I will honor this obligation until my last breath. In Washington's personal effects found by his children after his death and carefully preserved, there was a worn copy of Becker's book, with pages softened by repeated reading. In the margins throughout were notes in Washington's handwriting, observations about the parallels between German ideology and American segregation, about the universal human capacity for rationalized prejudice, about the difficulty and necessity of confronting comfortable lies with uncomfortable truths, about the long, hard work of breaking cycles of hatred and building societies based on genuine recognition of equal human dignity. On the final page, beneath Becker's conclusion, Washington had written in his careful, distinctive script, "Grace is not the absence of justice or the ignoring of sin. Grace is the space where transformation becomes possible when truth is honestly confronted and burden is willingly accepted. It does not erase the past or minimize harm done. It opens a path forward that honors both the demands of justice and the possibility of change." And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.